close your eyes and imagine yourself far from the sterile, white corridors of a modern hospital. No beeping machines, no latex gloves, no pills neatly wrapped in silver foil. Instead, imagine a world that existed thousands of years ago, when disease was a mysterious and often frightening shadow that people could neither see nor fully understand. In ancient times, diseases were not explained by germs or viruses. People did not know bacteria, microscopes, or a scientific understanding of infection. Disease was often believed to be the work of angry gods, restless spirits, or even a curse cast by an envious neighbor. The human body, in their eyes, was a fragile vessel, a receptacle that could easily be disturbed by unseen forces. Let's take a leisurely stroll through this old world of disease and the unusual ways in which people tried to heal themselves. Ancient Egypt, medicine of the gods. We begin with the Nile, about 3,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt, health was closely linked to religion. The Egyptians believed that illnesses could come from the gods or from evil spirits that had taken over the body. Priests and healers worked side by side, combining spiritual rituals with practical treatments. The famous Ebers Papyrus, a medical scroll written around 1550 BCE, contains hundreds of treatments. For a cough, an Egyptian doctor might recommend a mixture of honey, milk, and the ground seeds of certain plants. For burns, a paste of resin and fat was applied. Some treatments were surprisingly common sense. Honey, for example, has natural antibacterial properties, but others were more mystical. For a headache, a dried crocodile skull might be applied to a patient's head while protective spells were recited. Surgery existed, but it was primitive and risky. Cuts and wounds were treated with linen bandages soaked in oil or wine. For broken bones, wooden splints were applied, tied with cloth to immobilize the limb. But along with these practical actions, there was always magic. Spells were whispered. Amulets in the shape of the Eye of Horus were worn to protect the sick. And when all else failed, they prayed to the gods for mercy. Ancient Greece, the birth of medical theory. Now let's go back to ancient Greece, around 400 BC, where the physician Hippocrates lived. He is often called the father of medicine, and for good reason. Hippocrates and his followers believed that illness was not a punishment from the gods, but the result of a natural imbalance in the body. This idea gave rise to the theory of the four humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. They believed that health was a perfect balance of these humors. Too much or too little of any one of them caused illness. For example, too much black bile could lead to sadness, what we now call depression. Too much blood could cause fever and aggression. Treatments were aimed at restoring the balance. This might include bleeding, using leeches or small cuts to remove excess blood, or purging, using herbs to induce vomiting or diarrhea to cleanse the body of harmful substances. Greek doctors also valued diet and exercise. They prescribed certain foods for certain illnesses, believing that poor diet could disrupt the humoral system. And in some cases, they used surprisingly modern methods, such as flushing wounds with clean water. Still, there were limits. Without knowledge of germs, they could not stop infections. Surgery was rare and dangerous. Many patients survived despite their treatments, not because of them. Ancient Rome. Engineering health. Moving to the Roman Empire, we find a civilization that valued order, structure, and public health. The Romans built aqueducts to bring fresh water to cities and sewer systems to carry away waste. They understood that dirty water caused disease, although they did not know why. Roman medicine borrowed heavily from the Greeks. The four humors still played a central role in healing. But the Romans brought their own practical approach. Military doctors treated soldiers on the battlefield, performing amputations when necessary, and washing wounds with vinegar. Public baths played an important role in maintaining health. People believed that bathing not only cleansed the body, but also balanced the humors. Rich citizens had personal doctors, while the poor turned to community doctors or apothecaries. Herbal medicine was widespread. Herbs like mint, rosemary, and garlic were used to treat digestive disorders, respiratory problems, and infections. Some remedies helped. Others were useless or even harmful. Ancient China, harmony and energy. Now we go far to the east, to ancient China, where medicine developed in a completely different way. Instead of humors, Chinese doctors believed in the balance of yin and yang and the flow of qi life force energy in the body. Disease was seen as a disruption of this balance. To restore it, healers used acupuncture, placing thin needles at specific points along the body's meridians to improve the flow of qi. Herbal medicine was highly developed. Ancient Chinese medical texts list hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products used for medicinal purposes. Ginseng for strength, ginger for stomach problems, dried orange peel for coughs. Diet, lifestyle, and emotions were all considered part of health. A healer might recommend changes in sleep patterns, breathing exercises, or meditation as part of treatment. The dark side, ancient plagues. But in all these civilizations, no matter how advanced their knowledge seemed, one enemy was always stronger: plague. Without any understanding of germs, ancient societies were powerless against outbreaks of the plague, smallpox, or typhus. Entire cities could be wiped out in weeks. People often resorted to prayer, sacrifice, or strange rituals to drive out the evil causing the disease. Sometimes fear led to cruelty. Foreigners or strangers could be blamed for spreading disease. Villages closed their gates, leaving the sick to die in the streets. Strange and dangerous cures. Some ancient treatments seem shocking today. In medieval Europe, ground-up mummy, yes, actual ground-up human remains, was sold as a cure for headaches and bleeding. In ancient India, cow dung and urine were sometimes used medicinally because they were thought to have cleansing properties. Mercury, lead, and arsenic, all toxic, were used in various cultures to treat skin conditions and syphilis. While they sometimes killed bacteria, they also poisoned the patient. The path to modern medicine. Over the centuries, these early practices gradually evolved. Observation and experience began to replace pure superstition. Some ancient remedies, like honey for wounds or willow bark for pain, from which aspirin was made, remain effective today. Others, thankfully, have been forgotten. It's easy to look back and smile at the strange treatments of the past. But without them, we might never have reached modern medicine. Every mistake, every superstition, every partial truth, they were all steps on the long road to understanding disease. And so, as we sink deeper into our quiet state, imagine the ancient healers in their quiet rooms, grinding herbs, whispering prayers, and doing the best they could with the little they knew, hoping, as all healers do, simply to ease suffering. By the time we reached the great ancient civilizations, illness was no longer just a private affliction. It had become a public concern, capable of affecting armies, economies, and even the survival of entire cities. In Egypt, scribes recorded illnesses on papyrus, not only as a medical record, but also as a spiritual testimony. For them, a fever could be the work of angry gods, or the intrusion of an evil spirit. Therefore, treatment often consisted of two parts, physical and spiritual. The patient was given honey mixed with crushed herbs to soothe the throat, while a priest recited spells from the Book of the Dead. Honey was one of the most prized medicinal ingredients in Egypt. Its antibacterial properties were unknown to modern chemistry, but its effectiveness had been observed for centuries. Honey was used to dress wounds to prevent them from rotting. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the Tigris and Euphrates region, healers carried clay tablets with hundreds of symptoms and treatment recommendations. They also believed that illness could be a punishment from the gods, or a curse imposed by an enemy. Some treatments were surprisingly practical. Beer mixed with certain plants to improve digestion, oils to soften the skin, while others were rituals with incense, figurines, and prayers designed to exorcise the demons of disease. The Greeks began to shift the emphasis toward observation and reasoning. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, encouraged doctors to study the environment, diet, and habits of their patients. He proposed that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of one or a deficiency of another could cause disease. This theory dominated European medicine for nearly 2,000 years. Treatments included bloodletting, special diets, and tonic herbs designed to restore balance. But despite all this progress, ancient medicine still had its limitations. In Rome, for example, public health measures like aqueducts, sewers, and public baths helped prevent some diseases. But plague epidemics still raged across the empire. Roman doctors studied Greek writings, performed surgeries, and prescribed herbal remedies. But without an understanding of the pathogenicity of microbes, many diseases remained incurable. In China, medical traditions developed along a different path. By the Han Dynasty, doctors were writing about the flow of qi, the body's vital energy, and its pathways, called meridians. Acupuncture, herbal medicine, and moxibustion, burning dried herbs close to the skin, were practiced not only to treat disease, but also to maintain balance and prevent disease. Ancient Chinese herbal treatises list hundreds of ingredients, from ginseng for increasing vitality to ephedra for breathing problems. In the ancient world, some diseases were familiar to everyone: fever, cough, stomach upset, while others remained a terrifying mystery. Smallpox left its victims disfigured or dead. Tuberculosis could last for years. Parasites thrived in places with poor sanitation. Many remedies were only partially effective. Others may have done more harm than good. Still, these early healers laid the foundation for everything that came after them. By the beginning of the Middle Ages, much of the ancient knowledge had been preserved in scattered manuscripts kept by monks, scholars, and doctors in the Islamic world. Here, medicine took another leap forward. By the time the sun set behind city walls, ancient streets were often filled with the faint coughs, wheezing, and slow steps of people weakened by illness. In many civilizations, illness was not just a personal affliction. It was part of everyday life. Without modern sanitation or an understanding of germs, disease spread silently and inexorably, carried by water, food, or simply human contact. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest civilizations to survive today, healers kept clay tablets listing symptoms and treatments. Diseases were often considered the work of spirits or the displeasure of a god. A scribe might record that a patient with a fever should be given a mixture of honey, beer, and herbs, not necessarily because it would cure him, but because each ingredient had symbolic significance. Honey was considered pure and protective. Beer was associated with nutrition, and herbs carried nature's blessing. In Egypt, medical practice combined observation with ritual. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical scroll dating to around 1550 BCE, describes hundreds of ailments, from toothaches to digestive problems, and how to treat them. Some treatments were surprisingly practical. Willow bark for pain, which we now know contains salicylic acid, similar to aspirin. Others were more mystical. The use of amulets, chants, or the application of sacred oils to ward off the evil forces thought to cause illness. Doctors in Egypt were often specialists. One might specialize in stomach ailments, another in eye problems, and a third in injuries. Whatever their skills, however, they worked in a world without knowledge of bacteria and viruses. So prevention often meant avoiding bad air, bad water, or the curse of an angry deity. In ancient Greece, physicians like Hippocrates pioneered a more rational approach to medicine. They developed the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, believing that disease resulted from an imbalance of these fluids. If a patient had a fever, they might be bled to reduce the excess hot blood. If the patient seemed lethargic, they might be given laxatives or emetics to cleanse the system. While much of this was based on guesswork, it marked a shift from purely supernatural explanations to observation and diagnosis. Roman medicine, drawing on Greek knowledge and the vast resources of the empire, introduced public health measures that were cutting edge for its time. Aqueducts provided clean water, sewers carried away waste, and public baths provided a modicum of hygiene. Roman military doctors were adept at treating wounds, fractures, and infections. They used surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, hooks that seem commonplace today. But even Rome could not avoid outbreaks of disease. Plagues swept through cities, spreading along trade routes and armies. When disease struck, quarantine, prayer, and the distribution of herbal remedies might be the answer. Far to the east, in ancient China, medicine followed a different philosophy. Practitioners sought to maintain a balance between yin and yang, the opposing forces of nature. Disease was seen as a disruption to this harmony, often related to the flow of qi, or life force. Acupuncture, herbal medicine, and dietary regulation were all tools for restoring balance. Some herbs were chosen for their cooling properties, to counteract fever, others for their warming properties, to combat chills and weakness. In rural areas, folk remedies passed down through generations combined with more formal medical traditions to create a varied and flexible system of treatment. The ancient Indian system of Ayurveda also focused on balance, but through the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, which represent movement, heat, and stability in the body. Treatments might include massage with medicated oils, careful diet, and the use of spices such as turmeric, which have healing properties. Although the philosophy of Ayurveda differed from that of the Greeks or Chinese, the idea of restoring harmony rather than simply treating symptoms was common to many early medical systems. The diseases themselves varied from place to place, but some were nearly universal. Tuberculosis, known for its slow, debilitating effects, left its mark on remains thousands of years old. Malaria, carried by mosquitoes, plagued river valleys and swamps. Leprosy, with its visible skin lesions, was feared and often led to the isolation of those afflicted. Dysentery, caused by contaminated to combat chills and weakness. In rural areas, folk remedies passed down through generations combined with more formal medical traditions to create a varied and flexible system of treatment. The ancient Indian system of Ayurveda also focused on balance, but through the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, which represent movement, heat, and stability in the body. Treatments might include massage with medicated oils, careful diet, and the use of spices such as turmeric, which have healing properties. Although the philosophy of Ayurveda differed from that of the Greeks or Chinese, the idea of restoring harmony rather than simply treating symptoms was common to many early medical systems. Food or water was a constant threat, especially in crowded cities. Without antibiotics and vaccines, survival often depended on the strength of a person's immune system, the quality of care, and sheer luck. In retrospect, it's easy to focus on the limitations of ancient medicine. A scribe copied another healing recipe onto papyrus. In a Roman camp, a surgeon sharpened his instruments for yet another wounded soldier. In a Chinese village, a healer brewed an herbal infusion to relieve a fever. They could not have known the science we know today, but their work laid the foundations of modern medicine. One careful observation, one hopeful cure at a time. And as night fell on those distant worlds, the sick rested in their homes, in tents, or under the open sky, relying on the hands of those who tried, with the tools at their disposal, to keep them alive. Let us return to our slow walk through the corridors of time. We are in the bustling streets of ancient Rome. It is the 1st century AD, and the empire stretches from the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Britain. Rome is powerful, rich, and populous. But in the shadow of its great temples and marble baths, disease stalks silently. The Romans were proud of their aqueducts, which brought fresh water into the city. But as the streets became denser and the poor areas filled with people, waste disposal became a serious problem. In some areas, sewage was poured directly into the streets. Flies and rats flourished. Fevers, intestinal infections, and skin diseases were constant companions of the urban poor. Roman medicine was heavily influenced by the Greeks, especially Hippocrates, and later Galen. Doctors believed in the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and believed that illnesses arose from an imbalance between them. Treatment often involved bloodletting, laxatives, or herbal concoctions. For a fever, a doctor might recommend drinking vinegar mixed with honey. A wound might be treated with wine, believing the alcohol would prevent infection, which, by the way, sometimes worked. But not all treatment in Rome took place in clinics. Ordinary citizens often resorted to home remedies: garlic, vinegar, olive oil, and even powdered oyster shells were used for everything from stomach pain to skin rashes. Amulets and talismans were also common. Some wore small figurines of gods or pieces of lead with inscriptions around their necks, hoping to ward off illness. In the military camps of Rome, doctors known as medica traveled with the legions. Soldiers suffered from dysentery, trench foot, festering wounds, and malaria. The medici had basic surgical instruments, bronze scalpels, forceps, and bone saws. They could set broken bones, drain abscesses, and remove arrowheads. The camps even had makeshift hospitals called valetudinaria. However, without an understanding of germs, many procedures carried a high risk of infection. Now we leave the grandeur of Rome and head further east to ancient India. Here, the medical tradition of Ayurveda has been practiced for centuries. The Sanskrit texts known as the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita define disease as an imbalance of the body's natural energies, or doshas. Indian doctors classified hundreds of ailments and recommended herbal remedies, massage, dietary regulation, and surgery. Sushruta, often called the father of surgery, described techniques for removing cataracts, repairing broken bones, and performing skin grafts. His surgical kit included knives, hooks, and needles. Ayurveda also placed great emphasis on hygiene. Bathing, cleaning wounds, and cleaning instruments were all important parts of treatment. In some ways, this set Ayurveda apart from many other cultures of its time. From India, we cross the sea to ancient China. Here, the art of healing is based on the principles of yin and yang balance and the flow of vital energy, or qi, through the body's invisible channels. Chinese doctors believed that illnesses were caused by blockages or imbalances in this energy. Treatments include acupuncture, in which fine needles are inserted into specific points to restore balance, and herbal medicine, with complex mixtures of roots, leaves, and minerals. The Chinese were also among the first to recognize the importance of prevention. They practiced early forms of smallpox vaccination, inhaling powder from scabs or injecting them under the skin, a risky but sometimes effective method, centuries before Edward Jenner's work in Europe. And now, we move slowly into the medieval period, where medicine takes on an even stranger and more uncertain form. By the late Middle Ages, European medical practice had become a curious mix of superstition, inherited Greek theory, and religious ritual. Doctors still relied heavily on the teachings of Galen, a 2nd century Greek physician whose ideas about the four humors dominated for over 1,000 years. They believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you bled too much, they prescribed bloodletting. If you had too much phlegm, they might give you peppered wines or heated air to dry you out. And if you had too much black bile, which was associated with melancholy, you might be advised to eat warm, moist foods and avoid sadness, which European medical practice had become a curious mix of superstition, inherited Greek theory, and religious ritual. Doctors still relied heavily on the teachings of Galen, a 2nd century Greek physician whose ideas about the four humors dominated for over 1,000 years. They believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you bled too much, they prescribed bloodletting. If you had too much phlegm, they might give you peppered wines or heated air to dry you out. And if you had too much black bile, which was associated with melancholy, you might be advised to eat warm, moist foods and avoid sadness, which, of course, was pretty hard when you were already sick. But at the same time, Europe was also quietly benefiting from a much more advanced medical tradition from elsewhere, the Islamic Golden Age. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became centers of medical knowledge. Here, scholars translated ancient Greek and Roman medical texts into Arabic, as well as improving them with their own discoveries. Figures such as Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, wrote detailed medical encyclopedias, while Ibn Sina, Avicenna, compiled the Canon of Medicine, a work so influential that it was used in European universities until the 17th century. To human bodies more openly after discovering that Galen's anatomy, based on animal dissection, contained errors. Still, the Renaissance also brought with it a peculiar fascination with exotic and mystical remedies. Some wealthy Europeans began using powdered mummy, yes, literally the pulverized remains of Egyptian mummies, as a cure for a variety of ailments, especially headaches and internal bleeding. The ancient process of embalming was thought to preserve some mystical life force that could be absorbed. This strange trade in mummies was so lucrative that grave robbers in Egypt emptied tombs to supply apothecaries across Europe. Not all cures were as macabre, but many were just as bizarre. Frog potions were popular in some regions. A live frog would be placed in a cloth bag and tied around the patient's neck to draw out a throat infection. Spiderwebs were applied to wounds to stop bleeding, which, to be fair, sometimes worked, since webs help blood clot. In England, a doctor might prescribe wearing the dried hand of a hanged criminal to treat arthritis. And mercury, a toxic metal, was often swallowed or rubbed into the skin to treat syphilis, leading to symptoms that were sometimes worse than the disease itself. The Renaissance also saw a flourishing movement of traveling quacks, peddling miracle potions from brightly painted carts. They offered bottles of colored liquids, herbal concoctions, and mysterious powders, each promising to cure everything from baldness to the plague. Some of these remedies had some truth. Certain herbs could reduce fever or improve digestion. But many were harmless sugar waters or dangerous poisons. By the end of the 16th century, medicine was at a crossroads. Scientific observations began to overcome superstition, but people still clung to amulets, talismans, and magical practices. A patient might turn to a learned doctor or a local healer, combining a dose of laudanum with a prayer whispered over a bowl of water. It was a time when the boundaries between science, faith, and folklore were thin and fluid, and a patient's bedside table might contain both a jar of leeches and the relics of a saint. Strange medicine through the ages from medieval Europe to the Renaissance. Imagine for a moment that you've just stepped out of a smoky, dimly lit medieval apothecary. The scent of dried rosemary and crushed garlic wafts across your clothes. You've just purchased a jar of what the apothecary calls pulvis mumia mummy powder. He claims it will cure everything from headaches to melancholy. You don't ask how he got it. In fact, it was probably ground up from the body of an ancient Egyptian, stolen from a tomb. In 14th century Europe, such things weren't considered shocking. They were fashionable. We'll get there soon. But first, let's linger a little longer in late medieval Europe, where medicine was as much about faith and ritual as it was herbs and anatomy. Leech therapy and the balance of the humors. In 1380, if you had a fever, the local doctor might examine your tongue, then nod gravely and declare, "Your humors are out of order." The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to govern not only your health, but your character. In fact, it was probably ground up from the body of an ancient Egyptian, stolen from a tomb. In 14th century Europe, such things weren't considered shocking. They were fashionable. We'll get there soon. But first, let's linger a little longer in late medieval Europe, where medicine was as much about faith and ritual as it was herbs and anatomy. Leech therapy and the balance of the humors. In 1380, if you had a fever, the local doctor might examine your tongue, then nod gravely and declare, "Your humors are out of order." The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to govern not only your health, but your character. Too much blood? You might be cheerful, but feverish. Too much black bile? Melancholy, sadness, and a tendency towards stomach ailments. The cure? Bloodletting. The easiest way to do this was with leeches. An apothecary would remove a leech from a wooden bucket full of wriggling greenish-black creatures and take it out. It would be applied to the patient's skin, behind the ear, for example, or on the forearm, and left there until it was full. Sometimes the patient would lose consciousness. Sometimes he would get worse, but the doctor would say that the treatment had drawn out the excess and the balance would be restored. Much of Europe relied on superstition and the ancient texts of Galen. The Islamic world experienced its own medical renaissance during the Middle Ages. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, doctors studied anatomy, wrote encyclopedias, and developed early surgical techniques. They translated Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian medical works into Arabic, preserving and expanding ancient knowledge. One of the most prominent figures was Avicenna, Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine became one of the most influential medical textbooks in history and was used in European universities for centuries. Avicenna emphasized observation and diagnosis over blind adherence to tradition. He wrote about contagious diseases, nutrition, and the importance of hygiene. Hospitals in the Islamic world. Unlike the scattered infirmaries of Europe, the hospitals of the Islamic Golden Age, known as Bimaristans, were large, well-organized, and often free to the public. They had departments for treating various diseases, training programs for doctors, and even pharmacies stocked with locally produced medicines. Patients were treated not only with herbs, but also with diet, fresh air, and music therapy. Picture this hospital in 11th century Damascus. White plaster walls, tiled fountains in the courtyard, the scent of mint and rosewater wafting through the open windows. Patients reclined on clean beds, tended to by doctors in white coats. It seemed a world away from the European leper colonies of the same era. The Renaissance, curiosity, and the body. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was changing. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in science, art, and anatomy. Dissection, once taboo, became a subject of fascination. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci sketched human muscle and bone with breathtaking precision. Yet even as knowledge grew, strange cures persisted. Powdered unicorn horn, usually made from narwhal tusks, was sold as a cure for poison. poultices of frog skin were applied to wounds. Mercury was given for syphilis, with horrible side effects. And yes, mummy powder remained a popular universal cure until the 17th century, the Islamic golden age of healing. If we leave behind the grimy streets of medieval Europe for a moment, and instead head east, across the Mediterranean, we find ourselves in a much warmer, cleaner, and in many ways more advanced world. It is the 9th century, and Baghdad is sparkling in the sun. It is the peak of the Islamic Golden Age, a period of incredible scientific and medical progress. The caliphs, the rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate, are wealthy, inquisitive, and eager to gather knowledge from all over the known world. While much of Europe relies on folk healers and prayer, the Islamic world is building hospitals called Bimaristans. These are not only places where the sick can receive free medical care, but also centers of learning where doctors are trained. Inside these hospitals, the air is faintly scented with herbs and rosewater. The floors are tiled, the windows are open to let in light and fresh air, and patients are given clean bed linen. This is remarkable for the time. Doctors here do not operate blindly. They observe, record symptoms, and sometimes even operate using sterile instruments. A doctor might grind cinnamon, myrrh, and saffron into a fine powder to make a soothing paste for a stomach ache. They consult thick, hand-copied medical texts. One of the most famous is Al-Razi, later known in Europe as Rahazes, author of the comprehensive Book of Medicine. Another outstanding figure is Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, whose canon of medicine would be used in European universities for centuries to come. The treatments here are often surprisingly rational. Cooling drinks for fevers, balanced nutrition for the weak, music therapy for sadness. Of course, there are also unusual remedies: pearl powder for a rapid heartbeat, or drinking water with gold for cheerfulness. But compared to European leech baths, this is simply paradise. However, diseases know no borders, and even in the cleanest and most well-appointed hospitals, outbreaks of plague and dysentery cannot always be stopped. Patients lie quietly on low beds, shaded by white curtains, and the sound of a fountain in the courtyard can be heard from the windows. Late Middle Ages, the return of old beliefs. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, some Islamic medical knowledge penetrates into Europe thanks to translations made in Spain and Sicily. European scientists suddenly begin to read Avicenna, Galen, and Hippocrates, but old superstitions stubbornly persist in everyday practice. In many towns, the local barber is the man you go to if you have a toothache or a deep cut. His red and white pole is the symbol of his profession: red for blood, white for bandages. He can extract a rotten tooth with iron pincers, while his assistant holds you still while you grit your teeth in pain. He might also offer cupping therapy, using small glass jars heated over a fire to pull back the skin. Believing this will draw out the bad humors from the body. Meanwhile, wealthy people sometimes invite doctors to their homes. These doctors dress in luxurious robes and carry leather cases full of herbs, powders, and unusual instruments. But their treatments are still often based on astrology. If Mars is in an unfavorable position, they might say it's a dangerous day to give blood. Rebirth, mummies, unicorn horns, and frog potions. As we move into the 15th and 16th centuries, something strange happens. Europe is rediscovering ancient lore, exploring the world, and printing books in huge print runs. And yet, in some ways, medical beliefs become even stranger. This is the era of mummy therapy. Yes, crushed, ground up mummy. Merchants bring mummies from Egypt, and apothecaries sell the brownish powder as a cure-all, especially for internal bleeding. It is expensive, fashionable, and utterly useless, but nobles are willing to pay a high price for it. We also find unicorn horn powder, usually carved from the tusks of the narwhal, which is believed to protect against poison. Rich households use goblets for their wine, supposedly made from unicorn horn, in case the drink is poisoned by rivals. There are potions made from crushed emeralds, dried lizards, pearls dissolved in vinegar. And in the villages, old folk remedies continue to be used. If you rub a wart with a live frog and then let it go, the wart is said to go away with it. At the same time, real advances are beginning to appear. During the Renaissance, anatomy began to be studied seriously, often secretly, since dissecting human bodies was controversial. Surgeons like Ambroise Paré develop more sophisticated methods of stitching wounds, moving away from the old method of pouring boiling oil. But the contrast is striking. Crushed gemstones were sold next to the first surgical textbooks. Astrological charts were being drawn up in the same city where the first scientific medical schools were opening. It is a world halfway between magic and modern science. As the Middle Ages progressed, European medical thought became increasingly shaped by a mixture of classical ideas and folk remedies, with a dose of superstition woven into the fabric of everyday life. Cities like Paris, Bologna, and Montpellier established medical faculties that drew on the works of Galen and Avicenna. But outside the lecture halls, people still trusted the wisdom of village healers, monks, and midwives who relied on herbal infusions, prayers, and incantations. One can imagine a modest apothecary on a narrow, cobbled street. Inside, the rich aroma of dried lavender, rosemary, and sage mingles with the earthier scent of ground roots and resins. The shelves are lined with clay jugs with inscriptions written in neat handwriting: Pulvis radicis angelicae, for protection against the plague; Unguentum calendulae, for softening wounds; Aqua vitae, a disinfectant and tonic. The apothecary would mix medicines according to the patient's humoral imbalance, prescribing cooling cucumber water for a fever, for example, or warm spiced wine for chills. Sometimes the logic was sound. Other times, it was more symbolic, based on the doctrine of signatures, which held that a plant's appearance revealed its healing power. The walnut, which resembled the human brain, was thought to cure headaches. The liverwort, whose leaves resembled the liver, was used for jaundice. Medicine was never limited to plants and powders, however. It included ritual. The ringing of a church bell during a plague epidemic was thought to purify the air. A patient might be advised to sleep with a holy relic under his pillow, or to drink water in which a saint's bone had been dipped. In some places, the medical and spiritual worlds were indistinguishable. Illness could be both sin and illness. By the 14th century, the Black Death had swept across Europe, bringing with it not only unimaginable losses, but also a frenzy of desperate treatments. Doctors wore long, beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing they would filter out the poisonous fumes. People burned juniper branches in their homes, held bouquets of flowers to their noses, or placed vinegar-soaked napkins on their mouths. Some took to wearing amulets of dried toads or bags of mercury, convinced they would draw the disease from the body. Travel east, and you'll find that the Islamic Golden Age still held true to its sophisticated medical traditions. Scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba preserved and expanded on ancient Greek and Roman texts, but also introduced their own innovations. Hospitals, or bimaristans, offered free medical care to the sick, with wards, pharmacies, and training facilities for medical students. Physicians such as Al-Razi and Ibn Sina emphasized careful observation of symptoms and the importance of hygiene, principles that took centuries to gain the same respect in Europe. Still, the line between sound medical science and curious experimentation was thin. A 13th century physician might recommend a strict diet or a potion made from ground pearls. Some treatments were cross-cultural: opium as a painkiller, rosewater to soothe inflammation, camphor as a cooling agent. Others were more unusual. Ground-up mummies imported from Egypt were thought to have powerful healing powers and were found in pharmacies in both the Islamic world and Renaissance Europe. With the advent of the Renaissance in the 15th century, interest in the human body blossomed again. Dissection, previously taboo, became a way to understand anatomy more accurately. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci sketched muscles, bones, and organs with scientific precision. But the same era that celebrated reason and art also gave birth to some of the strangest medical treatments in history. Alchemists experimented not only with metals, but also with the human body, searching for elixirs of life. A popular cure for epilepsy during the Renaissance was to drink the fresh blood of an executed criminal, preferably while still warm. Crushed gemstones were taken for a variety of ailments: rubies for heart health, emeralds for eyesight, diamonds for strength. And yes, crushed mummy, known as mummy, was still widely consumed, often mixed with wine. The preserved flesh of ancient bodies was thought to contain a powerful life force that could be transferred to the living. As night falls on our imaginary journey, picture a candle-lit office in 16th century Venice. A doctor sits at a desk, quill in hand, surrounded by books in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. On the table are jars of dried herbs, vials of strange powders, and a silver bowl containing a few drops of herbal tincture. Outside, the city sleeps, its canals silent, except for the occasional splash of water on stone. Inside, a doctor ponders his next case, perhaps a wealthy merchant suffering from melancholy, or a sailor overcome by sea fever. His tools are knowledge, faith, and a touch of the mystical, and he will use them all. 17th century, the age of reason, and leeches. The 17th century was an era when Europe was buzzing with new scientific discoveries. Telescopes were pointed to the heavens, and philosophers wrote about reason and logic. But when it came to medicine, the body was still largely understood through the lens of the ancient humoral theory, the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that were thought to determine a person's health and character. Doctors now had slightly fancier tools: brass syringes, magnifying glasses, even primitive microscopes. But the treatments, still medieval in spirit. Bloodletting was more popular than ever. Fever? They'd need a pint of blood. A rash? More blood. Feeling faint? Well, maybe you just need one last bloodletting. Leeches were kept in little glass jars in doctors' offices, like a collection of goldfish. Only these pets were for dinner. For dinner. Tobacco smoke enemas became incredibly fashionable in the late 17th century, especially in England and the Netherlands. Yes, they really did blow smoke literally into patients' rectums, believing it could revive drowning people or cure a cold or headache. River rescue kits sometimes included a long brass tube and a small handheld bellows for this procedure. It sounds like satire, but it was actually taught in polite circles. Surgical realities. The idea of antisepsis had not yet been born. Surgery was brutal and quick. Amputations were performed on kitchen tables, with assistants holding the patient down. Speed was the surgeon's goal. A quick amputation could take less than 2 minutes. The patient was given a wooden stick or leather strap to bite down on. Interestingly, barber surgeons were still common. The local barber could cut your hair, trim your beard, and, if necessary, remove an arrowhead from your arm. The famous red and white barber's pole dates back to this period, symbolizing bloody bandages and clean cloths twisted together. 18th century. Enlightenment and weirdness. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment had placed greater emphasis on observation and experimentation. Dissection schools became popular in European cities, where medical students would gather in cold stone theaters to watch the dissections of executed criminals. In London, tickets to these events were sometimes sold to the general public, a macabre form of entertainment. Smallpox vaccination was one of the first major medical breakthroughs. Borrowed from the Ottoman Empire and Asia, the practice involved deliberately infecting a person with a mild form of smallpox to build immunity. It was risky. About 1–2% of people still died from the procedure, but far better than the 20–30% death rate from the severe form. But with this progress came some stranger beliefs. Mummy powder was still a common medicine, sold by apothecaries as mummy, supposedly infused with life-giving powers. It was scraped from real Egyptian mummies, or more commonly, from conveniently mummified corpses dug up in hot, dry climates. People ingested it to treat epilepsy, bruises, or simply to boost their vitality. Animal-based medicines were also popular. Burnt pigeon droppings mixed with honey were thought to cure sore throats. Powdered toad was prescribed for rheumatism. In rural Europe, a black spider sealed in a walnut shell was worn as a necklace to ward off fever. By the end of the 18th century, Europe was at a crossroads. On the one hand, the first vaccines had appeared, knowledge of anatomy had improved, and the first glimmerings of germ theory were emerging. On the other hand, you could still walk into a drugstore and buy snake oil, mummy powder, and a jar of unicorn horn powder, usually ground up narwhal tusk. Okay, let's continue our journey through history and jump right into the 19th century, where history takes a turn that's both astounding and terrifying. Victorian medicine, the age of chloroform and guesswork. The Victorian era, roughly 1837–1901, is famous for steam locomotives, stiff collars, and a disturbing love of arsenic in wallpaper. But in medicine, it was a time when science and superstition shared a doctor's bag. You could operate with the latest chemical marvel, chloroform, and still be told to carry a potato in your pocket to prevent rheumatism. Until the 1840s, surgery was all about staying awake and screaming. Patients were held down by assistants, and a surgeon's greatest skill was speed. The faster he sawed off a leg, the better his chances of surviving the pain and blood loss. But then came anesthesia, Ether was first used in Boston in 1846, and by 1847, Scottish obstetrician James Young Simpson introduced chloroform. Chloroform changed everything. It rendered patients unconscious in minutes, allowing surgeons to work slowly and carefully. Although slowly is relative. An amputation might still take less than 10 minutes, since infection was already waiting to set in. Queen Victoria herself famously used chloroform during childbirth in 1853 and 1857, giving the practice royal approval. Unfortunately, anesthesia didn't solve the other problem: germs. Victorian surgeons often operated in blood-stained gowns. The more stained, the more experienced you looked, using instruments that had never been sterilized. They might finish one patient's operation and move on to the next without even washing the scalpel. This is why surgery, for all its new glory as painless, still had a horrific mortality rate. The cause of death was often not the operation itself, but sepsis, blood poisoning. In fact, in some hospitals, statistics showed that your chances of survival were better if you stayed home and hoped your leg healed crookedly than if you had surgery. The rise of the hospital and the risks. By the mid-19th century, hospitals had become more common and respected. In previous centuries, they had been more like almshouses or monasteries, places where people came quietly to die rather than to be healed. Now they began to resemble the organized medical centers we know today, but still without any concept of sanitation. Surgeons wore frock coats caked with old blood, which was considered a good luck charm. Students stood shoulder to shoulder in operating rooms, literally operating rooms, with tiered chairs, watching the famous surgeon's show. The patient was often the only person in the room not enjoying the spectacle. Then, in the 1860s, along came Joseph Lister. No, not the guy who invented mouthwash, although Listerine was later named after him. Lister had read Louis Pasteur's work on germs and realized that invisible organisms could be killing people during surgery. He started spraying carbolic acid in operating rooms, washing his hands and instruments before operations. And, miracle, his patients stopped dying in alarming numbers. Many of his colleagues thought he was overly scrupulous. After all, a real Victorian surgeon prided himself on his bloody sleeves and his ability to smoke a cigar during surgery. But gradually, the idea caught on. Killing germs could save the patient. Home medicine, patent remedies, and snake oil. While hospitals were gradually adopting scientific methods, ordinary Victorians still relied heavily on patent medicines, vials sold by traveling salesmen, in newspapers, or at the local chemist. These concoctions promised to cure everything from headaches to tuberculosis, and often contained alcohol, opium, mercury, or a cheerful mixture of these. Some were genuinely dangerous. Others merely provided a pleasant intoxication. But they were hugely popular, especially in rural areas where doctors were scarce. The middle and upper classes also experienced this era of obsession with health tonics, from cod liver oil to mysterious mineral waters. A fashionable Victorian might go to a spa to take the waters, which meant drinking foul-tasting, sulfur-smelling mineral water in the belief that it would cleanse the body. In fact, it mostly cleared your social calendar, since everyone else at the resort was doing the same thing. 19th century doctor's toolbox. If you visited a doctor in the 1800s, they might use leeching, still used today, for swelling and infections, lancing, draining boils, abscesses, and anything swollen, lickening, applying hot plasters or chemicals to cause blisters, considered drawing out the disease, opium for pain, coughs, diarrhea, and insomnia, bloodletting for less popular by mid-century, but still used, chloroform/ether for surgery, tooth extractions, and sometimes just nervous conditions. By the end of the 19th century, medicine had finally become recognizably modern. Germ theory was accepted. Anesthesia became safe enough for routine use. Hospitals became cleaner. But the Victorian era brought another gift: the birth of public health as a government responsibility, with new laws on sewerage, clean water, and slum reform. For the first time in history, a city dweller had a better chance of survival than his country counterpart. By the mid-1800s, Britain stood proudly at the center of an industrial empire, but its hospitals and surgeries still vaguely resembled those of centuries past. Only now, they were more crowded, dirtier in places, and, for the first time, had something astonishing at their disposal: chloroform. Chloroform, discovered for medical use in the 1840s, was a miracle. Imagine the relief it promised. Before its arrival, surgery meant screaming patients, a surgeon working at breakneck speed, and a crowd of medical students pressed against the table, watching every move. Pain was part of the deal. Operations were timed with a stopwatch, not for the sake of accuracy, but because a patient could only stand so much pain before his convulsions became uncontrollable. The advent of chloroform and its slightly earlier cousin, ether, revolutionized surgery. It could render a patient unconscious without even realizing the knife was there. Queen Victoria herself famously used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, approving the practice with a royal decree that silenced many critics. Newspapers called it blessed chloroform, and doctors were able to perform longer, more complex procedures. But chloroform's love affair was complicated. Dosages were tricky, too little, and the patient might wake up halfway through. Too much, and breathing might stop forever. Surgeons in those days often operated without understanding the exact science of anesthesia. Sometimes the cause of death after surgery was simply broken by chloroform. And here's the strange truth: anesthesia alone is not enough to make surgery safe. A patient might sleep through the procedure and die a few days later from infection, the silent killer of the Victorian ward. Hospitals were hotbeds of disease. Wards were crammed with beds. Windows were closed to keep out stale air. And instruments might be wiped down between patients or not cleaned at all. A surgical gown, crusted with old blood, was worn almost as a badge of honor, proof of hard work rather than a sign of risk. The idea that invisible germs could cause death had not yet fully taken hold. It took figures like Joseph Lister in the 1860s to change this. Inspired by Louis Pasteur's work on germs, Lister began experimenting with carbolic acid to clean wounds and sterilize surgical instruments. His early successes in reducing post-operative mortality encountered resistance from some older surgeons who disliked the hassle of antisepsis. But his methods spread, gradually transforming the surgical world. Meanwhile, public perceptions of medicine were changing. The Victorians adored the image of the daring doctor, part scientist, part explorer of the human body. But they were equally fascinated by the dark drama of the sickroom. Diseases like consumption had a strange, romantic aura, Pale cheeks and frail physiques became associated with refinement. Death was always close to life, but it was clothed in poetry. Medicine itself was moving in new, sometimes bizarre directions. Phrenology, the science of recognizing personality from the shape of the skull, was wildly popular, though it was little more than pseudoscience. Electrotherapy, mineral water treatments, and tonics containing opium or cocaine were sold as restoratives. The shelves of Victorian chemists were a curious mix of genuine achievements and advertising potions. Yet the achievements of the century were undeniable. Anesthesia, antisepsis, organized nursing thanks to Florence Nightingale, public health reforms, and an explosion of medical schools. Surgery was no longer a desperate race against pain, but a calculated attempt to cure, though the shadow of infection still lingered. By the end of the century, the stage was set for the leap into modern medicine. The instruments were cleaner, the theories sharper, the doctors better trained. But the cost of achieving this goal was measured in the countless patients lost along the way, their names forgotten, their suffering the unspoken price of progress. By the mid-19th century, chloroform and ether had already begun to transform surgery. Before these anesthetics, surgery had been a public spectacle in the worst sense of the word. Surgeons prided themselves on their speed. Amputating a leg in under a minute was considered a mark of professional skill. With the advent of anesthesia, speed became less important than precision, and doctors could finally take their time removing tumors or healing injuries without leaving the patient writhing in agony. But controlling pain did not mean controlling infection. Operating rooms still smelled of unwashed gowns and festering wounds. Surgeons often wore the same frock coat for years, allowing it to collect blood and pus like a grim badge of honor. This was before the pioneering introduction of antiseptic surgery by Joseph Lister in the 1860s. Lister, inspired by Louis Pasteur's germ theory, began spraying carbolic acid on wounds, instruments, and even the air in the operating room. Many of his colleagues considered it fussy, and some even mocked him. But his survival rates spoke for themselves. Antisepsis gradually gained popularity. By the end of the Victorian era, surgical mortality from infection had plummeted, ushering in a new era of medicine. The 19th century also saw the emergence of nursing as a respected profession, thanks in large part to Florence Nightingale. Her work during the Crimean War, 1853-56, helped provide wounded soldiers with sanitation, fresh air, and nutritious food, simple measures that saved countless lives. Hospitals began to transform from chaotic, disease-ridden warehouses for the dying into more organized, hygienic places for healing. Yet, despite all these advances, the Victorian patient could still encounter some eyebrow-raising treatments. Mercury was prescribed for syphilis, and many were poisoned. Bloodletting, though in decline, was still practiced by a few stubborn connoisseurs. Tonics containing opium or cocaine were freely available, sold for everything from toothache to female hysteria. And mental illness was often treated by confining patients to asylums with little or no real medical intervention. Yet the combination of anesthesia, antisepsis, and better hospital care meant that surgery, once a near certain brush with death, was now possible. By the end of the 19th century, the world of medicine was on the cusp of modernity, although it remained partly rooted in traditions that would soon disappear. So, with the advent of the 19th century, Victorian medicine entered an era of astonishing innovation and bewildering controversy. It was a time when scientific breakthroughs coexisted with deeply flawed beliefs, and when progress in one field could be undermined by stubborn adherence to outdated practices. In short, it was an era when chloroform could make surgery painless, but an unwashed scalpel could just as quickly send you to the grave. One of the most famous inventions of that era was chloroform anesthesia. In 1847, a Scottish obstetrician named James Young Simpson began experimenting with the substance, first on himself and a few dinner guests, a typically Victorian way of testing a medical theory that involved inhaling unfamiliar chemicals at the dinner table. Chloroform turned out to be powerful and much more pleasant smelling than ether, which was previously used for anesthesia, but unfortunately caused patients to cough violently or even vomit during surgery. Chloroform's reputation soared in 1853, when Queen Victoria herself chose it to deliver her 8th child, Prince Leopold. The Queen described the experience as soothing, and immensely delightful, a bold statement in an era when women were generally expected to endure childbirth without complaint. Overnight, chloroform became fashionable, not just in hospitals, but in private homes, where doctors sometimes suggested it for difficult deliveries or particularly lengthy dental procedures. But chloroform was not without risks. Doctors were still learning dosages, and the fine line between pain relief and heart failure was occasionally crossed. Several tragic cases, notably the sudden death of a young girl in 1848, demonstrated the risks. Still, Victorian enthusiasm for painless surgery outweighed concerns. Speaking of surgery, it was the 19th century that made the operating room a real event. Before the advent of anesthesia, surgeons had to work at lightning speed, often completing amputations in under 2 minutes to put a patient out of their misery. With the advent of chloroform, there was suddenly time for more meticulous, complex procedures. Unfortunately, that extra time also meant longer exposure to germs, and here's where the contradictions of the Victorian era came into play again. With germ theory still in its infancy, many surgeons proudly operated in their scrubs, often caked with the dried blood of previous patients. Instruments were rarely sterilized. Surgical assistants might smoke or eat in the operating room. And spectators, yes, operations were sometimes performed in public, might lean in a little too close. It took the work of Joseph Lister in the 1860s to establish the concept of antisepsis. Inspired by Louis Pasteur's research, Lister began using carbolic acid to treat wounds and surgical instruments. At first, his colleagues resisted. Some complained about the smell, others about the length of the procedure. But as survival rates improved dramatically, the medical world began to acknowledge that invisible germs might indeed be a problem that needed to be addressed. Meanwhile, Victorian medicine was also struggling to balance scientific progress with societal beliefs. Doctors debated the treatment of women's hysteria, a diagnosis that could cover everything from anxiety to postpartum depression, with treatments ranging from relaxation to the use of strange electrical devices. Mental health was poorly understood, and asylums were often overcrowded, underfunded, and grim. On the other hand, public health was improving. The Public Health Acts of the mid-19th century addressed sanitation, clean water, and urban overcrowding, all critical to reducing the spread of disease. Smallpox vaccination became more widespread, though it faced resistance from those who distrusted the practice. By the end of the century, medicine had changed beyond recognition from its beginnings. Anesthesia, antisepsis, and basic public health measures had laid the foundations of modern medicine, though much remained to be done. The Victorians had led us out of the era of flashy surgery, but the shadow of infection and the limitations of modern science still loomed. And so, we flash forward to the last years of the 19th century. The Victorian era is on its last legs. Gas lights flicker in the streets, and in the quiet of the operating room, something amazing happens. Here, chloroform changes everything. Once, surgery meant being held in strong arms and screams echoing off tiled walls. Now it's a soft cloth pressed against your face, a strangely sweet smell, like overripe fruit. Your limbs grow heavy, your eyelids flutter, and for the first time in human history, you sleep despite the knife. The doctors stand in snow-white coats, although snow-white is a relative term. Many wear the same apron for weeks, with barely noticeable brown stains that were once bright red. Sterilization is in its infancy. A scalpel can be rinsed with water, wiped on a sleeve, and used again. But compared to the past, it's a miracle that patients survive operations that would once have been an instant death sentence. Hospitals change themselves. Long wards line up, one after another. Beds. In the air, there's a subtle smell of carbolic acid, sharp, designed to prevent infection. The nurses move silently, in neat uniforms. The influence of Florence Nightingale is felt in every step. And yet, beyond these clean corridors, poverty and disease rage. Tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid still kill by the thousands. And yet, there is hope. In small glass bottles on the doctor's desk lie powders and potions. Some are truly effective. Others are just colored sugar. But faith in medicine is growing. People are beginning to believe in the idea that perhaps the future will be healthier than the past. The world is on the brink of something great. The hum of electricity, the promise of vaccines, and at the turn of the century, humanity is poised to enter the modern age. By the end of the Victorian era, medicine had begun to take pride in itself. Hospitals were cleaner than at any time in centuries. Doctors wore white coats, though they weren't always washed. In fact, a dirty, blood-stained coat was often considered a badge of honor, proof that its wearer was busy saving lives, even if he was, in fact, just as busy spreading germs. But there was a quiet revolution: antisepsis. Thanks to Joseph Lister, surgeons began spraying a thin layer of carbolic acid on their instruments, their hands, and even their patients' wounds. It stung their noses, burned their throats, and left a distinctive, pungent odor in the air. But it worked. Fewer people died from infections after surgery. And then came chloroform. Before it, surgery was a test of endurance, not just for the patient, but also for the surgeon, who had to work quickly before the screams became too loud. But with chloroform, the patient would fall into a deep, quiet sleep. A small handkerchief over the face, a few breaths, and silence. It seemed miraculous. Of course, Victorian doctors didn't fully understand the dosage at first. Some patients never woke up at all. Still, the public's fascination with painless surgery was enormous. Even Queen Victoria herself famously took chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, giving the method her royal seal of approval. As we walk through the quiet, gas-lit wards, we hear the soft hiss of a chloroform bottle being opened, the rustle of surgical cuffs, the soft tinkle of polished instruments on a tray. In the background, the clock ticks steadily, marking the slow but sure march of medical progress. Victorian medicine was a strange combination, part science, part tradition, part guesswork. Doctors were armed with new knowledge of germs and anesthesia, but they still clung to ideas that belonged to centuries. A patient might be treated with an antiseptic spray or a restorative tonic of alcohol, opium, and herbs. It was a time of contrasts. The flickering light of candles over steel instruments, the smell of carbolic acid and fresh linen, the sense that the world was finally moving towards something cleaner, kinder, and less painful. So we slide forward into the early years of the 20th century. The world is on the move. Cars rumble along cobbled streets, telegraph wires hum faintly overhead, and medicine enters an era of great promise and quiet danger. Hospitals, now more common in cities, shine with polished copper and tiled floors. Doctors wear crisp white coats, a symbol of modern science, and the smell of the disinfectant carbolic acid hangs in every corridor. It's sharp, burning, almost metallic, but for patients, it symbolizes hope. In operating theaters, tables are now lit by electric light, replacing flickering gas lamps. Surgeons work with new instruments of gleaming steel, sterilized in boiling water or hissing steam. Anesthesia, once a dangerous experiment, has come of age. Ether and chloroform are still used, but now there are masks, measured doses, and careful observation, although in 1905, observation might have meant little more than a nurse watching your lips change color. Yet not all is safe. X-rays, a marvelous discovery of the 1890s, are used with wonder and little fear. Radiologists stand next to the machine, their hands glowing ghostly on the photographic plates, unaware of the lesion growing in their bones. Radium, too, is hailed as a panacea, sold as glowing tonics and health products. Its faint blue-green glow perceived as vital energy, even as it burns quietly from within. There is no penicillin in the wards yet. A simple cut can still kill. Tuberculosis stalks crowded tenements, and the sick are sent to open-air sanatoriums, where rows of beds are rolled out onto balconies so that patients can breathe the fresh mountain air. Nurses cover them with heavy wool blankets, and the sound of the wind in the pines replaces the noise of the city. But despite these dark sides, the early 20th century feels very different from any era before it. More confident, more scientific, more certain that the great mysteries of disease will soon be solved. There is an optimism in the air, a sense that the age of epidemics is drawing to an end. But as we move forward, history will remind us that optimism is fragile, and the world is about to face trials that no hospital, no doctor, no shiny white coat can prevent. Let us now fast forward to the first decades of the 20th century. The world moves faster than ever before: steamships, automobiles, telegrams flying in the night. And yet, war looms on the horizon. The coming of World War I introduces a grim new chapter in the history of medicine: the field hospital. Picture a large canvas tent with billowing flaps, pitched far enough from the front lines to escape artillery fire, but close enough that the ground still shakes with the distant rumble of guns. Inside, the air is heavy and strange. The sharp smell of carbolic acid, the coppery tang of blood, and the earthy odor of wet uniforms. The stretchers arrive one after another, bearing soldiers wounded by shrapnel, bullets, or gas. Doctors and nurses work in dim light, their hands steady, but their voices low, murmuring reassurance to the frightened boys barely out of school. Ether and chloroform are still the primary anesthetics, poured onto cloth masks and held until the patient's eyelids close. But here, in this improvised, rushed theater of war, there is no guarantee of sterility. Instruments are quickly wiped down, sometimes rinsed with cold water, sometimes simply wiped with gauze between patients. Infection remains a constant, invisible enemy. And yet, progress is being made. Blood transfusions are becoming possible. X-ray machines, cumbersome and unreliable, are hauled into tents to detect bullets and shrapnel before the surgeon's knife is swung blind. Even plastic surgery begins here on the battlefield, as doctors attempt to reconstruct mutilated faces and hands. By the time of World War II, field medicine had evolved significantly. Mobile surgical teams were operating more quickly and in a more organized manner. Penicillin seems like a miracle, dramatically reducing disease rates and saving countless lives. Tourniquets, morphine syringes, bags of plasma are now the norm. Yet conditions remain dire. Surgeries in barns, amputations on folding tables, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and antiseptic. Yet in these makeshift hospitals, you can hear something unexpected. The soft chant of a nurse addressing a patient, the clink of enamel mugs, the quiet whisper of encouragement as another life is pulled back from the brink. You lie there, perhaps with your eyes closed. A gentle rustle of wind through the canvas tents fills the air. We are still in the makeshift world of battlefield medicine, somewhere between the front lines and the safe zones. This is the era of world wars, and every sound tells a story. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, the surgeon's hands move slowly, not with hesitation, but with the practiced calm of a man who has done this 100 times. The steel scalpel flashes for a moment, before disappearing into the shadows. Outside, the muffled rumble of artillery sounds distant, but the ground trembles slightly, like a faint heartbeat beneath your feet. A nurse walks past. Her steps are almost silent on the wooden boards laid out over the dirt. She carries a basin of warm water. The steam rises in delicate curls. The smell is slightly metallic, a mixture of boiled cloth, alcohol, and the earthy dampness of the walls of a field hospital. Somewhere nearby, a typewriter taps slowly. A nurse types out the names of the wounded, each letter a testimony that these people existed. Names, ranks, hometowns. For some, this will be the only official trace they will leave behind. A patient stirs in the cot next to you. The whispers try to soothe him, talking about home, about apple trees blooming in the spring, about the kitchen, where the smell of fresh bread hangs in the air. The voice is firm, but the eyes tell a different story, a story of exhaustion, and the quiet knowledge that not everyone here will see home again. In the far corner, a pile of boots, dirty, scuffed, some still with laces, sits next to a folded uniform awaiting incineration. Next to them, a wooden box of morphine ampules glimmers faintly in the light of the lantern. Each one precious, each one carefully labeled. The rain begins to tap softly on the canvas roof. You can almost count the drops. Slow, uneven, each one a reminder that behind these thin walls, war breathes and waits. Somewhere outside, a harmonica is playing, softly, unevenly. But here, even the softest melody feels like sunlight breaking through clouds. For a moment, the nurses, the wounded, the tired surgeons, all pause, listening. And for a moment, the war seems so far away. After the upheavals of the world wars, the land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The cities slowly began to rebuild. The rubble was swept away. The bricks were rebuilt. The windows replaced. However, if we mentally wander through these post-war streets, we will find that comfort was still far from perfect. In many industrial cities, the air was thick with coal smoke, a reminder that heating and industry still relied on sooty furnaces. Hospitals, although more advanced than in the days of field tents, still carried with them a certain aroma. The sterile smell of carbolic acid and chlorine, mingling with the faint human smell of the sick and convalescent. A nurse in a crisp white coat might pass by, her shoes tapping softly on the polished linoleum, the faint rustle of her apron marking her movements, the sound of sheets being adjusted, a patient's muffled cough, the quiet rustle of doctor's notes. All these quiet sounds made up the rhythm of recovery in the mid-20th century. And outside the hospitals, in the homes of ordinary people, life was adapting to new inventions. Picture a kitchen in the 1950s, the quiet hum of a small radio in the corner, the warm, bread-like smell of a coal stove, the hiss and crackle of something frying in a heavy pan. Tap water might not always have been safe to drink. In some cities, families still boiled it before drinking. Refrigerators gradually replaced iceboxes, and the quiet hum of these new machines became a familiar domestic lullaby. If you go outside, the streets are quieter than they are today. Cars hum as they pass, their engines unpolished, and bicycle chains click softly as they pass. People greet each other by name. The postman knows every house. The milkman leaves jingling bottles on the doorstep before dawn. And as the decades pass, in the 1960s, the air slowly begins to change. Cities begin to clear their skies. Medicine learns more about invisible threats, bacteria, viruses, the dangers of lead in paint and gasoline. Hospitals smell more of mild antiseptics than harsh chemicals, and the rooms where people are treated become ever gentler. But as always in history, the comfort comes unevenly. In the villages, far from the city hospitals, midwives still carry leather bags with instruments sterilized over a fire and work with their hands as hard as a surgeon. The creak of a wooden chair, the warmth of a wool blanket, a soft voice urging a woman in labor to breathe. These sounds and sensations have not changed for centuries. In the 1970s and 1980s, life speeds up. Air travel echoes into the background of the modern world. Trains and subways echo with countless footsteps. The streets begin to glow with neon signs. In cities like New York, Tokyo, and London, the soundscape is one of constant movement. But even if you close your eyes, you can hear faint, constant human sounds. A sigh from a tired person after a long day, a creaking door, laughter from a small cafe. Now, if you fast forward to the present, the smells have changed. The world has largely rid itself of the stench of the past. No more open sewers in the streets. No more smoky haze from every chimney. But traces of history still lurk in quiet corners. The stone bridge still smells faintly of river moss, as it did 1,000 years ago. The old library still holds that deep, papery scent of time. And in these moments, listening carefully, we discovered that history has never truly left us. It breathes quietly somewhere in the background, waiting for someone, perhaps you, to notice it. We arrive at a small field medical tent from the First World War. It is dusk, and the air is cool and heavy, saturated with the smell of damp earth and tarpaulin. Outside, the muffled rumble of distant artillery creates a low, constant background hum, like the roar of distant ocean waves. Inside, a single oil lamp burns, pouring out a warm, golden light. Shadows sway softly on the walls of the tent, the flames flickering in the breeze. A young medic kneels next to a soldier. The medic's movements are slow, measured, careful. His breathing is even, his voice soft and encouraging. The bandages are rough, linen, sterilized in boiling water earlier that day. There is no room for haste here. The war rages outside the tent, but in this small window of time, there is only the quiet work of caring for another person. There is a faint scent of iodine in the air. It mingles with the worn leather of knapsacks, the earthy smell of still damp boots from the trenches, and the faint sweetness of a lone candle burning nearby. Almost audible is the soft rustle of cloth being unrolled, the click of a tin can being opened, and the careful pouring of water from a metal flask into a shallow bowl. Every sound is distinct, but muffled, as if the world is wrapped in a blanket. We are floating forward, past the end of the war, into the 1920s. We are in a country doctor's office, perhaps in a small village lost in the hills. Winter. Snow presses softly against the windows. The old wooden floor creaks under careful footsteps. Shelves line the walls, filled with glass jars of herbs, tiny vials of tinctures, and neatly wrapped cloth parcels. A small iron stove in the corner radiates warmth, its quiet crackling and popping sounds blending with the sound of the wind outside. The pace of work is slow here. The doctor still makes house calls with a black leather bag. Inside is a velvet-lined thermometer, a stethoscope with polished wooden earpieces, and neatly folded cotton dressings. Each visit is personal, familiar, and the doctor's voice is as soft and soothing as the measured ticking of an antique clock in the next room. Time slows further as we move into the 1940s. World War II. Field hospitals again, but now with improved surgical instruments, more organized medical care, and the first antibiotics making their quiet revolution. In the dimly lit ward, nurses move like soft shadows between the rows of beds, their white aprons glowing dimly in the weak electric light. The soft squeak of rubber soles, the soft rustle of fabric, the tinkle of a glass bottle being lowered, all become part of a gentle nighttime lullaby. Outside, the wind carries the scent of wet grass and wood smoke. Inside, the air is warmer, infused with the scent of antiseptic, clean linens, and the faint aroma of tea brewing somewhere in the background for the night shift. A soldier stirs in his sleep, muttering, and is soothed by the nurse's quiet support. Here, the chaos of the world seems distant, replaced by the quiet rhythm of healing. We are transported again, this time to the 1950s, when more modern medicines began to appear in homes. Glass bottles with pastel labels sit neatly in the kitchen cupboards. Metal pill bottles jingle softly as they are opened. Families trust their local pharmacist, who still measures out powders with tiny brass measuring spoons and wraps them in wax paper. The click of a register bell, the clank of a store door opening, and the soft thud of newspaper pages on a counter are all part of the gentle soundtrack of the era. And so, we continue to drift through the decades, each moment, each room, each detail, a thread in the vast tapestry of human care and healing. The world changes. Tools improve, sounds evolve, but the gentle human intention, the quiet desire to help another person feel better, remains the same. The dim light of dawn filters through the edge of a makeshift canvas tent. Outside, the damp ground smells faintly of gunpowder and wet grass. There is a sound, the slow, measured rhythm of boots in the mud, unhurried, but with the quiet purpose of those who have done this before. We are still in a field hospital, somewhere near the front, in the final years of World War II. The air is cool, and every sound is enveloped in a soft, hushed silence, as if the world were holding its breath. On one side of the tent, a young nurse carefully unwinds a bandage from a soldier's arm. The bandage is dirty, but dry. It slowly slides away, revealing skin riddled with bruises. The soldier does not flinch, his gaze fixed on something far away, perhaps at a memory, perhaps at nothing at all. She says nothing, simply applies fresh gauze with the practiced gentleness of someone who has done this hundreds of times. A kettle sits on a low fire nearby. You can hear the water begin to heat up. Tick-tock, hissing. At times like these, the simplest things become precious. A warm drink, a clean rag, a folded blanket. Steam rises and swirls in the cool morning air, carrying with it the faint scent of tea leaves. Through a crack in the tent, you can see an open field. The grass, heavy with dew, bends under the weight of the moisture. In the distance, a cart creaks, its wooden wheels quietly complaining of its load of supplies. Every creak and crunch of gravel blends into the quiet morning chorus of the camp. The medic sits at a small folding table, filling out patient histories with a fountain pen. The pen barely scratches the paper, a sound so soft it almost blends with the whisper of the wind against the fabric of the tent. Each name written is a story. Some will come home, some will not. He pauses, dips his pen in ink again, and continues. In the corner, a soldier sleeps, his head bandaged, his chest rising and falling unevenly. The blanket around him is thin, but someone has tucked it tightly under his chin. Soft whispers escape his lips, not words, just quiet snatches of sleep. Time moves slowly here. The sun rises higher, goldening the edges of the tarpaulin. Somewhere, a bird cries, just one sound, and then all is silence. War is everywhere. But in this small corner of space, there is only the measured, painstaking work of saving lives. Nurses move silently from bed to bed. Medics prepare morphine with slow precision. Patients breathe, and the tent breathes with them. Even the sound of distant artillery is softened here, like distant thunder rumbled against the constant low hum of human survival. You sit down on an empty cot. The mattress is thin, the frame creaking but feeling stable. You close your eyes. The sounds mingle: the scraping of a knob, the hissing of a kettle, quiet voices. You imagine the soft thud of boots on wooden floorboards from another era, the smell of carbolic soap from another war, the feeling of washing your hands after a long shift. You are part of the slow heartbeat of history. And the day in the field hospital goes on, one quiet sigh at a time. Candle flames flicker softly on the worn wooden beams above, casting slow-moving shadows on the uneven plaster walls. The year is 1602, the very heart of Moscow, the last years of Boris Godunov's reign. Outside, winter has come early, coating the small window panes with delicate patterns of ice. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings, a deep, low note that seems to hang in the cold air long after the metal has died away. Outside, there are faint footsteps on the frozen ground crunching, the slow, weary tread of villagers carrying bundles of thin firewood or sacks of rye, their movements heavy with hunger. The Great Famine has reached almost every home. The summer harvest failed not once, but several years in a row, after unusual rains and unusual frosts destroyed the crops. In some villages, people boiled the bark of trees to make it edible. In others, stray dogs have disappeared, and the smoke rises not from warm hearths, but from improvised fires, cooking something at least a little nutritious. You breathe slowly, listening. Somewhere nearby, there is a soft rustle of fabric as someone wraps a wool shawl more tightly around themselves. Then the clay cups set on the table jingle softly. A family has gathered in the semi-darkness. They speak softly, their words merging into a whisper that makes you want to close your eyes and simply listen to the sound of their voices. One of them, an elderly man, begins to remember a time when the fields were golden and the air smelled of freshly mown hay. His voice is slow, almost rhythmic, as if the memory itself warms him. But every now and then, his voice trembles, because even he cannot ignore the current hunger. If you go back even further, you can imagine the smell of rye bread straight from the oven. But now, this year, bread is scarce and expensive. At Moscow's markets, a single loaf costs more than most families can earn in a week. The city itself is restless. Peasants come from the villages hoping for food. Traders whisper about grain deliveries that never arrive. Guards patrol the Kremlin walls in the pale winter sun. The wind sighs softly through the shutters, and in that sound, you can almost hear the unspoken fear of the people. Not just of hunger, but of what might come after it. Disease, unrest, the collapse of the established order. And yet, life goes on. Mothers still sing lullabies, though their voices falter occasionally. Candle wicks still burn, though shorter than before. Bells still ring, announcing the hours, the births, the deaths, the inexorable passage of time. You follow the sound of the bells into another part of the city, past narrow alleys where the wooden houses lean slightly, past frozen puddles reflecting the dim light, past the thick walls of the monasteries where the monks chant in deep, booming voices. Inside, the air is warmer, thick with the scent of beeswax and incense. The chanting is slow, measured, the very rhythm that calms the mind and makes the heart beat more steadily. You listen, and the sound becomes part of the air itself. Everywhere the past is alive, not in sharp bursts, but in a soft, drawn-out way, like slowly falling snow.